Just a reminder, it's oneclimate.net's island on Second Life. Chance to talk to delegates, participants, and get an idea without coming here and adding to the problem. That's what we're trying to do. So, yes, I'm still trying to get a picture of the negotiations. But now there's an adaptation fund is agreed. We don't know how much money there'll be, what you'll get out of it, but that's one key item. Is there anything else that the people you're working with want out of this conference?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, the flip side is mitigation, and you're looking at the development of a negotiating process over the next 2 years that will hopefully bring all countries on board to some extent in mitigation efforts, in efforts to reduce emissions. And so you have parties that have Kyoto targets negotiating future targets. So that process is ongoing and will continue for the next 2 years. But we're now looking at a timetable for that negotiating process over the next 2 years and how that will work. Then we have this parallel process. It's called, the dialogue that's wrapping in basically countries that don't have Kyoto targets. So these two processes are going on at the same time. They'll relate to each other over time. But this is another big outcome of this session. What will those two strands, what will they look like moving forward over the next 2 years? Because we'll need to reach an agreement in 2009 so that these targets and efforts will be firmly in place when the first Kyoto Protocol commitment period runs in 2012. Essentially, countries need time to reach agreement and then nationally ratify that agreement internally using their own national procedures so that the whole agreement will enter into force under international law in time to ensure no gap between the first commitment period and second commitment period. So,
yes, so you want clear commitments to cut emissions. That's getting down to the nitty-gritty, isn't it?
That's why we're here, yes.
But are there indications? I must tell you, we have one from Isa Kamachi who says, "Yes, I love MJ. She's brilliant." Oh, you've got a fan club out there. So, yes. Well, hey, treasure everyone.
Yeah,
so, are there indications this time around that countries, either industrialized countries who are supposed to be committed to making cuts already, that they're really serious about it, and maybe there's a hope of getting the non-Kyoto countries, which actually means the US, and then further down the line, developing countries will have to come into this process. They're excluded at the moment because of their, as it were, their right to develop and to catch up economically. It would be unfair if they couldn't develop because the emissions so far have been built up by industrialized countries. But is there a sense, do you get a sense among other delegates that we're a little bit more realistic this time around, or are you just optimistic?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of goodwill in the process, and I think there's certainly a recognition after the IPCC's fourth assessment reports come out that it's in everyone's interest to get in the game and to figure out how best you as an individual country can contribute to the mitigation effort. A lot of the discussion here is going to have to do, and already has to do, with how quote-unquote positive incentives can be provided to developing countries to enhance their mitigation efforts, whether it's through sectoral approaches like reducing emissions from deforestation, or whether it's through renewable energy technologies, or different ways that you can provide incentives. What are positive incentives? It can be access to market-based tools. It can be concessionary financing. It can be anything. We haven't really talked about what those positive incentives might be, really, but it's very clear that in asking developing countries to step to the plate and do something, there's also a need to provide the resources and the technology to enable those countries to do something. And so that's a good bit of what the debate is looking like. What can those incentives be? What can they address? What should be the scale? And how can those incentive measures be conveyed?
Are there different goodies and baddies in this negotiating round than in previous ones?
Well, I mean, every country negotiates to protect its national interest and to advance its national interests, and I think you just have to keep that in mind. I mean, I think everybody kind of knows who the goodies and the baddies are in this process, and it's just a matter of hoping that there can be ways to encourage the baddies to become less bad.
Okay, who are your natural allies in this? Do you have a natural allies, or are the small island states so specific that they're on their own?
Thanks. That's a good question. It's easier to answer who the small good guys are than who the big baddies are. I mean, I think natural allies in this process for small island states are least developed countries. There's a group of about 49, 50 least developed countries. There's some overlap with the small island state group, but these folks have similar vulnerabilities. Often they're similarly economically challenged, and so the LDC group presents a natural allied group. On the mitigation, certainly on adaptation issues. On the mitigation side of things, the EU has been fairly progressive. So the Alliance of Small Island States has a good bit in common with the EU, although, of course, small island states would be pushing for greater efforts on mitigation than the EU's looking at. The EU's talking, can we limit temperature increases to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels? And for small island states, again, 2 degrees is too much. Can we look at concentration levels that will take you below a 2-degree centigrade increase? Because the challenge is once a certain degree of concentration is reached, the impacts on sea level rise just continue no matter what because of the inertia in the climate system. So it's essentially even if you were to flatten out emissions, in the next 10, 15 years, you would still see sea level rise continuing over time, and that's the killer for small island states, really.
Okay, we've got less than a minute to go. I'm going to throw one last one at you. Ken from London, what are the island states' attitude to aviation? Isn't tourism their lifeblood? Do you want to cut the flights or do you want the tourists?
This is a tough question. I think it's a tough question because, many countries, certainly in the Caribbean, are very, very, very dependent on tourism just to keep their economies running. But, of course, I suppose it provides opportunities as well. If you were to put a small tax on visitors coming in, well, that might help you a bit with your adaptation needs. And I think there have been discussions about that in some small island countries. Just because it's in some ways it's a ready source of revenue. Yeah, it's a mixed bag. It's clear that emissions from aviation are just going up at an unbelievable rate. Overall, emissions in the greater scheme of things, are maybe 2%, 3% of overall. For example, Annex 1, it gets too technical, but it's the rate of increase that's so horrifying, and the rate of increase itself is increasing. So. Something is going to have to be done, and probably the only way to do something is to increase the cost and just deter a few travelers. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very, very, very much for coming out, and hope we haven't held up negotiations. But get back in there and save the world. Thank you so much for coming. Yeah, it's very kind.